Hello, hello, and welcome again to a Beatles show that we call Things We Said Today. This is a talk show in which we talk about anything that has to do with the Beatles, any part of their history, their music, you name it, the past, present, any part of their careers we cover here on this show. I'm Ken Michaels. I'm one of the co-hosts of the program, and some of you might know me from my other Beatles show, which is called Every Little Thing. And I'm being joined by my three other co-hosts of the show, my regular co-hosts, beginning with the man who writes for Beatles Examiner, that being Steve Marinucci. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Ken. Hello, everyone.
And also we have one of the writers for Beatle Fan Magazine, that being Al Sussman.
Hi, Ken. Hello there, everybody.
And actually, we do have another writer for Beatle Fan, but he also is a music critic and musicologist, and that being Allan Kozin. Hi,
Hello,
Allan.
everyone. Hello, everyone. Hello, Ken.
We have a very interesting topic indeed for the show this time out, and it has to do with the Beatles and whether or not we think that while they were together, they made any mistakes. And this was an idea that I came up with. I hope I'm not going to regret coming up with that particular topic, because when I first brought up this idea last week, Steve already had a book written on this particular theme. So I don't know if we're going to be able to cover it all in 1 hour here on the show. So let's get to our main topic of conversation here, and that is to talk about the Beatles' mistakes, if there are any. And apparently, between the rest of you, and I just have a few here, in many ways, I've always kind of viewed the Beatles as being as close to perfect a band as you can have. And I've said on a number of occasions that certainly where their catalog is concerned, what they recorded as a group is as solid a catalog as you can ever have. I've never felt that the Beatles ever gave us a bad song. Everything in the Beatles catalog has gone from good to great. Of course, that is debatable, depending on who you want to talk to about this particular subject. But as far as mistakes, I want to clarify something right here. We're only talking about the time when the Beatles were together. We're not talking about the time before Ringo joined, so anything concerning the way the Beatles handled Pete Best, for example, that wouldn't fit this category. Or, for that matter, anything that followed the Beatle breakup. So we're not going to get into the Beatles should have released this concert or these recordings. It's only about the time when the Beatles were together as a foursome, and we're talking mainly creative and business decisions. So, who would like to start? Actually, Steve seems to have quite a lot.
And you know which one I'm going to go with? And you know which one I'm going to say first. You know it.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. So I will say it. Magical Mystery Tour should not have happened. I think, and Ken and I had a major discussion. I think you guys remember when the reissue came out. They did everything they could to pump up the hit, to make that, to pump up the history and to put a new spin on it. But really, looking back at it, it really didn't do any good as far as I was concerned. So I think they could have come up with a better project. It was basically a vanity project. And granted, they were kind of, in limbo because of Brian's passing, and they were looking for, they didn't really have any direction. But that really was not something they should have done, my thinking. Your reaction, guys?
I partly agree. There was a certain amount of hubris involved. The idea that we are the Beatles and we can do anything, and having just come off Sgt. Pepper, where they pretty much proved that they could do anything, and it was one of Paul's ideas where okay, let's be not the Beatles, we'll be something else, and that worked. So this was his next thing, but the thing is that Pepper was an album. They knew how to make albums. This was making a film, and especially without an actual script. And they were not incredible improvisers, or at least they were not incredible improvisers when there were mics and cameras on for producing something for public consumption. If you listen to some of John's tapes that he made in the privacy of his home where he's just messing about, he's quite a funny improviser, but somehow when the big red light was on, he was a bit less so.
They did good at the press conferences. I mean, they were great.
Oh yeah, well that's true.
Those press conferences were funny to listen to.
Yeah,
I don't know what and they obviously had to improvise there, but for some reason, in this situation, it didn't work out as well.
But those were just quips, It's a little different than having to come up with a coherent film or something that would be made to look like a coherent film when cut together. But I have to agree with Paul when he always points out when Magical Mystery Tour is criticized. Well, you did get I Am the Walrus, and if you cut as I've done on various occasions when back when we used to make our own video mixtapes, just cut all the other stuff out and put the songs together and make a video album of the Magical Mystery Tour songs. It's not only pretty good, but it's about half the time of the film. So really the rest is just okay, it's another half hour of messing about. And and it's also it introduced Ivor Cutler to the world. I don't know if any of you guys subsequently became Ivor Cutler fans, but he made a bunch of very funny albums for Virgin Records in the early 1970s, and and I had not heard anything about him since Magical Mystery Tour and didn't realize that here was a guy with a really quirky career, and so when I saw the first of those albums, I thought, wow, that's the guy in Magical Mystery Tour, and they were very funny, and he was very funny in the film. And I think that also after hearing his records and getting a sense of sort of his kind of comedy, then going back to Magical Mystery Tour, it helps it a bit, I think. So yeah, I mean, I have really mixed feelings about Magical Mystery Tour. It was one of the ones on my list, so I seem to be supporting it, but but hey, that's just for argument's sake.
Yeah,
yeah.
It does have its good points, But
Allan's on the right trail there. Yes, definitely. The music sequences are definitely are definitely fine. But actually, even visually, even the most recent iteration of the film just doesn't look good. It wasn't filmed well. There just seemed to be very little in the way of preparation for this. And you would have figured that having worked with Richard Lester, they would have learned some things about filmmaking. And it just seemed that they just decided, well, we're going to make a film, and they did absolutely no preparation for it. And also, obviously, a lot of the humor in there is very, very, very English humor. The whole bus tour motif is very much an English thing, and all. So, obviously, American audiences didn't really get a lot of that. But it just seemed there was just a lack of preparation, a lack of advance work, and also the fact that they rushed into it right after Brian's death, within about 2 weeks, if I recall correctly, that the filming began. The whole process just seemed rushed, and there was no need for it, because in those days, at that point in time, it wasn't as if, as in the past, they had to rush something to get it finished before they went out on tour. They weren't going out on tour. They could have taken all the time in the world they wanted to do this and do it properly. And it's just and especially since it was a professional project of theirs, it was maybe the first major blemish on their record.
Okay, well, I can see your points, and I agree with some of what as I've said. Now, why is this funny? I think one of the things that I appreciate most about the Beatles was their change, and the fact that you watch all of their films, and none of them are identical to each other. They're all different in their own way. And I think when they approached this, they weren't thinking to themselves, I've got to make another A Hard Day's Night here, or Help. This was as free form as could be. Now, some people don't go for free form. But, there is something to be said here about, and I want to raise this to, especially to you, Steve, and to you, Allan, because we've been talking about the Beatles' music in previous episodes. You're two guys who have been saying that you like a song like What's the New Mary Jane? Okay?
Uh-oh.
Here's a song that's as free form as could be. There's no real serious structure to it. It's really silly lyrically. It doesn't really go anywhere. You either like it or you don't. Now here are the Beatles making a film that's free form, very spontaneous. It was meant to be that way. And you don't go for that kind of thing. I know, Allan, at least, you're giving credit to the music sequences. But why is it that you can embrace the music when they're doing something like that, and then you won't embrace a film that's similar in that way?
I don't dislike the film really all that much, but if we're talking, I'm interpreting mistakes as also meaning something that didn't go over well at the time. Like the U.S. actually never picked it up. I mean, Al was mentioning about how U.S. audiences wouldn't have seen the whole bus tour thing, and that might be why a U.S. network didn't, just couldn't see it. But in a way, I mean, I'm thinking of it not that much as an artistic failure as a kind of commercial business failure in a way.
Okay.
I don't. I can sit through Magical Mystery Tour any number of times. It's not, I don't think it's the most horrible thing. But if I were to argue simply for the sake of arguing, I would point out that what's the New Mary Jane is only 5 minutes long, and Magical Mystery Tour is an hour.
Okay.
But I see your point.
Yes.
It's a good point.
But Magical Mystery Tour has I Am the Walrus in it, and Fool on the Hill, and Blue Jay Way, and Your Mother Should Know, and all these songs, and I think they have a bit more merit than What's the New Mary Jane would. That's my own opinion here. But it's just I appreciate the fact that the Beatles went in a different direction. But I just want to point out, because I know in the case of you, Steve, you just look at this Magical Mystery Tour as though no matter what, there's nothing you can say about it. It was a failure. And that's how we should all look at it. But I was just reading Hunter Davies' new book called The Beatles Lyrics, and I just thought, since I had a slight feeling you were going to bring up the film here in this conversation, I thought that I would bring up what he had to say about this. He writes, they should have worked harder on the script beforehand, planned all the scenes in advance, but the idea was to make it spontaneous, provide family amusement over the festive season. As a Beatle fan then and now, I enjoyed it. It was a modest, short film done on a budget. I couldn't see why the clever Clogs critics were so beastly. And then he writes, the songs, such as I Am the Walrus, have survived the test of time. The way the songs were shot as self-contained little rock videos was ahead of its time. Over the decades, the film has acquired a bit of a cult following. It has improved with age, as we all do, tra-la. So, that's how Hunter Davies feels about the movie. So, not everybody is in agreement with you, Steve.
Well, let me. I don't want to get into a heated debate, but I'm going to point out what Allan said, that this thing really had a British angle to it, and he's British, and I can understand that he would absolutely like it, but I think, especially from an American point of view, it just didn't make it. But okay.
I know, Steve, you have a few more you'd like to get to.
A couple of them had to do with concerts. One would be not recording Carnegie Hall. I think that was, I don't know what they were thinking there. That should have been recorded. And also, the other obvious thing would be not releasing full concerts, not recording Carnegie Hall, and not releasing full concerts from each year they toured during that time. I mean, everybody, there were a lot of people, the Rolling Stones, for example, that released live concerts, and the Beatles never did. And they could have done really well with with live concerts from each year that they toured in America. And Carnegie Hall would have been a great show because it would have had great acoustics, likely, and everything. And so, yeah, I think that, those would have been nicer. I'm not even going to get into, what they did with Hollywood Bowl. That's not a big deal. But I think the concert thing, I think everybody wishes that they had put out concerts.
Yeah.
Well, in the case of Carnegie Hall, George Martin did indeed want to record it, but it was, Allan, help me out here, was it the Musicians Union? Or
it was the union, the union. And in fact, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think I've seen the contract. I think we may all have. The contract actually provides for them to record at Carnegie Hall. There was a contract between EMI and Carnegie, and the fee was $300. So it probably was within anybody's budget.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
I think so.
But yeah, the Musicians Union had a thing about, here they are, they're foreign musicians, they're doing work here, they shouldn't be recording, and obviously they straightened that out by the time of the Hollywood Bowl. But it's a shame. It was a historic concert of which there is no documentation except for some still photos.
Right.
And no tape has turned. I'm amazed that a tape hasn't turned up yet. Somebody somewhere I bet has one.
Well, remember that in those days, it wasn't like it was, even 10 years later when people would be bringing small tape recorders into concerts. There really was no technology for that in 1864.
But someone did, in fact, actually. I was working for a while with Gino Francesconi, who's Carnegie Hall's archivist, and we were both doing everything we could to try and find a tape. And Gino got his hands on a bunch of pictures that show the Beatles on stage with the audience around them.
Oh,
and
right, with that one girl.
Yeah, there's one girl holding up a microphone. And he went to Sid Bernstein and said, assuming that the people who got the stage seats were somehow well connected, do you possibly recognize this woman? Do you know who she is? And Bernstein couldn't remember anything about it, so which is a pity. But he tried, Gino Francesconi tried everything. I did too. I mean, I had a lot of hints about the fact, the tape really does exist, and here's who has it. Someone told me once that Teo Macero, the jazz producer, had it. And strangely enough, after I actually panned a reissue of a Teo Macero Miles Davis recording, he invited me to the studio to watch them do, CD transfers and see what they did. And I thought, well, I'm going to go, not because I'm particularly interested I'm sort of interested in it, but I mainly wanted to ask Teo Macero if he actually had this tape, and he didn't. And then we were told that there was a stagehand named Dick Raven, great name, who was still at Carnegie at the time, but was a little unapproachable unless you knew him. That Dick Raven had it. So I found an usher who I had actually gone to school with, and persuaded her to sort of sidle up to him and see if she could get the tape out of him. And she came up with a great plan having to do with a bicycle that needed repair or something. And she asked him, and he had no idea what she was talking about. So all of these things ended up as dead ends. I mean, it's, we tried everything.
What a great story. I interviewed Sid several years ago, and I think I asked him about that, and he said no. So he said it wasn't recorded, as I recall. So.
And as for your other point about that there should have been a Beatles concert album for every tour, I mean, it's obvious why they didn't want an album out at that time, because their performances just were not because of all of the mania and everything, they realized that their performances just were not up to the quality of their recordings. I mean, for instance, if you the recent iTunes package of Beach Boys live recordings that came out in December, if you listen to those and you listen to the original Beach Boys concert album that came out in the fall of '64, you can see how much surgery was done on the finished product. And and I think, and I have a hunch that the Beatles just, and George Martin just would not have, wanted to go through all that much work to put out a representative live album. And
I disagree. I disagree with you, because I think in those days it would have been necessary. I mean, look what they did.
It wasn't necessary. I mean, they were the biggest act in the world.
Look what they did with Shea Stadium, though.
Yeah, they overdubbed a good portion of it. They obviously then, hey, it's one of the reasons why they stopped performing in the first place, because they could see their performances, the quality of their performance sliding downhill from, where it had been when they were playing, the Star Club to where, in the summer of '66, they, the last professional recording of them, which is the two Tokyo shows, and they're awful. And
yeah, no, but I think the Shea thing was overdubbed because of technical problems, not because of the quality of the concert, as I recall.
Well, that's all. The quality of the concert is probably the prime reason why it's never come out. People keep chanting that they want Shea Stadium, Shea Stadium, Shea Stadium, and all you have to do is read the interviews with them over the years and how much they hated how they sound, how their live recordings sound. Now you can see why it's never come out.
Right.
But that said, I mean, I've recently listened for various reasons to both Got Live If You Want It, the Stones live album, or semi-live album, and the Kinks live album. And Hollywood Bowl actually would have made a much better album than both of those. And they could have, I mean, it's also, since Steve mentioned it, about putting out a live album, maybe not for every year, certainly not for '66, but since they did go in and dub Shea and had a soundtrack that they produced for the TV show, I wonder why they didn't put that out as an album.
And there also is the Stones tracks from the movie they put out last year.
Charlie Is My Darling.
Charlie Is My Darling. And those, and I bought that from iTunes. Those are amazing. Those are incredible. I'm sure there's been some some upgrade on those tracks, but that's not to say that they couldn't have done that, and they could still do it. But I mean, that's not to say that they could have not played around with those tracks and made them commercial, or made them a commercial product.
But why do that? Why do what was done to Got Live If You Want It and the Live Kinks, which are not representative of what those two bands were like as live performers at that moment in time? God Live If You Want It is worthless as a document of what the Stones were, like live.
I agree, and Live Kinks isn't great either.
Right.
I mean, it's just you just figure that the biggest band in the world, they went to such EMI went to such lengths to put out stuff. I mean, look at what Capitol did with the way they butchered the Beatles albums. And I mean, you would have thought somebody would have come up with that idea, would have made that happen. It just seems like a possibility that that they didn't do. I don't know. You might be right that the Beatles themselves didn't want it, but
yeah, I don't. I think that's the primary reason, because in 1977, when the Hollywood Bowl album came out, that was at a point where they didn't have control over those recordings.
But we've heard the complete Hollywood Bowl tapes, because the bootleggers have had them. We've heard we've heard the complete or the unbridled Shea tapes,
right?
Because those have come out on bootleg,
right?
And there's something that could have been done, I think, with both of those, between the two. And they wanted to put out Hollywood Bowl. Remember? I mean, that was part of the deal. So I don't know.
But in the end, they vetoed it. According to Brown Meggs, anyway. I asked him directly once, and he said that John, in particular, just hated the sound of them. Mm-hmm. I mean, they put together test pressings and sent them to them, and they just rejected it outright at the time. Mm-hmm. So that was their decision.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, all right. So there we go. All right.
Yeah, with the Beatles, you're dealing with high standards.
Right.
And
exactly.
we're dealing with a group that cared a lot about the quality of what they put out, so they didn't want to put out anything that was substandard to them.
Right.
So it's one thing how the fans feel, and there are fans that will eat up anything and find it all fascinating. Mm-hmm. Doesn't mean that the Beatles feel the same way. So
okay, all right.
And what else, Steve?
Next.
Am I taking over this discussion?
No, it's good, because again, we're bouncing off of your points.
This one's a little controversial. I've always, after A Hard Day's Night, when they got to Help, you kind of looked at Help for a couple of reasons. Number one, the story. Number two, the fact that it was in color. So here I go, and this is probably going to get me some angry letters. But number one, doing Help in color. Period. And number two, maybe doing Help at all, because it was such a drop in the script from the brilliance of A Hard Day's Night. You guys are there's dead silence. There's dead silence now. Did he really
couldn't
say
disagree
that?
more.
Yeah,
I couldn't disagree more. But I think that Help was a brilliant film. Mm-hmm. I grew up on Help before A Hard Day's Night, actually. I saw it in the theaters, and it was breathtaking to see the Beatles in color. That was part of the reason why I loved it so much, because everything I saw of them prior to that was in black and white. I think the way the film was shot was so brilliant. Just like what Richard Lester did in A Hard Day's Night, it's just mesmerizing to see the Beatles on film in color, and just the cinematography, the way it was all done. Mm-hmm. To see the Beatles skiing on the slopes during Ticket to Ride is my favorite moment of them on screen. Granted, the script and the dialogue is not nearly as good as A Hard Day's Night, but it really is a very funny, entertaining film all the way through. And visually, I just find it to be stunning. And just like what Hunter Davies said about Magical Mystery Tour, and you could say this about A Hard Day's Night, you can take each individual song sequence and make a video of each one, as MTV did when they first started out, and they all work well as videos. And, the Beatles were naturally funny on screen with a script, and certainly in A Hard Day's Night with John with a lot of ad-libs. But even still, even though the dialogue wasn't as witty and as sharp as A Hard Day's Night, there's still some very funny moments in terms of the script itself and the dialogue. And just visually, it is just a stunning film for me to watch to this day. You could take each song, everything, The Night Before, You've Got to Hide Your Love Away, all that stuff, whether they're on a field, whether they're in their own room, that room that they all shared, though they all went into through separate doors, all that stuff. I love that. I thought it was brilliantly done. And also the cast around them, just like with The Hard Day's Night. Yeah. They were great. They were such a key component to that film. So, no, I totally disagree with you, Steve, on this. I know that the world, for the most part, has in history. What people are saying now historically is that A Hard Day's Night was so much more superior to Help, but it's still such a worthwhile film. I enjoy it just as much as A Hard Day's Night. I still do. But when it comes to lines in a film, nothing can top A Hard Day's Night. I always think of lines from A Hard Day's Night in my daily life. I still can with Help.
For that eventuality.
I could do the same thing for Help, and not as much as with A Hard Day's Night. But Help is definitely a worthwhile film.
Yeah. I don't think it's that much of a drop off in quality. It may not be quite as good as A Hard Day's Night, but there are still some very, very clever sequences in there. And as far as color, I never have had any problem with the fact that the film was in color. And again, if you're that, Steve, if you're that down on it, you can basically again take the musical sequences and just lump them together. And I'm sure you probably don't have much of a problem with those.
I'm not down on it nearly as much as Magical Mystery Tour, not at all.
Oh.
But I saw. I mean, unlike Ken said he grew up in Help. I saw Hard Day's Night the second day it was in the theater. I mean, I saw it in the theater, and girls were screaming and everything. So that's when I first saw it, and so again, having seen A Hard Day's Night and watched A Hard Day's Night, I mean, I can't even. If I was to count how many times I'd seen Hard Day's Night versus Help, Hard Day's Night would be huge. The difference is astounding. So
I can see why. I can see why you feel that way, and a lot of people feel that way. I mean, Hard Day's Night is, first of all, they are still fresh and new and lean. And also, even though it's fictionalized and scripted, it's kind of the Beatles playing the Beatles. In Help, they're already in what John is later calling his Fat Elvis period. They're getting high all the time. They're a little less into it. They're a little less excited about making this movie than they were about their first movie. And it's fantasy Beatles. It's weird fantasy Beatles. It's them doing things that but it's also supposed to be a little bit of a parody of James Bond, who was really hot at the time, and so it tried to do something else, and they couldn't have done Hard Day's Night Volume 2. I mean, they had to do something else, and this is what they did, and I think it was an okay choice. I like Hard Day's Night a lot more, well, a bit more than Help, but I like Help too. Since we're talking about films, though, since one of my mistake things actually only takes about one sentence, maybe I should interject it in here.
Sure.
Go ahead.
I think that they should have voiced Yellow Submarine. And I think that if they had paid attention
Very good.
Yeah.
I think if they had paid attention to what was going on earlier in the process, instead of just poo-pooing it until they finally went and saw what was being done and said, wow, this is cool, maybe they would have voiced it. But, I think they were taken by surprise by what they saw and liked it and decided to do that live bit at the end. But it would have, I think, been much better if they had done the voicing.
Funny thing is, when Paul was just recently on with Jimmy Fallon, he was talking about how people tend to do this fake Liverpool accent with their voices very kind of nasally and down, and that's exactly where that type of accent comes from. The voices that were done for Yellow Submarine. With that,
they have only themselves to blame.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
That's a great point, Alan.
Yeah, I'd actually never thought about that. So I think we're all in agreement on that one.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Next.
Okay.
Next.
Next.
So, Steve, any more?
Yeah. The obvious one that I think you guys would probably agree with is not making the American and the British albums different. But and I actually did not put that on the list, but that's something that occurred to me while I was sitting here. But along with that, I was thinking about Sgt. Pepper and the fact that they recorded Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields during those sessions and didn't put it on Pepper. and they also recorded It's Only a Northern Song. But I think there's been I've seen things where they had considered putting Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields on Pepper, and I'm kind of wishing they had. I don't think It's Only a Northern Song would have fit as well, but Strawberry Fields and Pepper I think would have been great on there.
You know, I'm a little bit tired of these criticisms that are done in hindsight. Sgt. Pepper did pretty good for itself, I think, just the way it was. And I know that we've heard George Martin say it a million times. The biggest mistake he ever made was not putting Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields on Sgt. Pepper. Sgt. Pepper was great just by itself. I mean, it had enough music to begin with. You would have had to have eliminated some of the songs on Sgt. Pepper to put those other two songs on there. And first of all, Only a Northern Song. George Martin did
it was
really,
only 35 minutes.
It was still like in terms of how many numbers of songs, it was still a full album to itself without those two songs on there. I mean, we grew up on this just the way it was, and none of us complained about it.
No,
and it's fine now to look.
and quite, and quite the contrary. That single was the perfect appetizer for Sgt. Pepper, plus the fact that by February of '67, most, hardcore Beatles fans were absolutely starving for a new release. I mean, I had gotten to the point where when I heard Kind of a Drag by the Buckinghams and Western Union by the Five Americans, the first time I heard them on the radio, I thought it was the Beatles. That's how much I was hungering for any new Beatles release, because remember that we hadn't had anything since the beginning of August, when Revolver and the single of Yellow Submarine and Eleanor Rigby came out. Plus, there were all of those breakup rumors that were rampant in the fall of '66. So by February of '67, we were absolutely ravenous for any kind of new Beatles music. And that single, which is, probably one of the 3 or 4 best singles that they ever released. I'd hate to have to pick one, but it's certainly one of them. And it was the perfect appetizer for Sgt. Pepper, and made, in fact, the wait for the new album all the more torturous.
Where would you put those two songs on Pepper in the sequence?
I obviously I didn't really think. I mean, somewhere probably on the first side, probably. But it just seemed like because of the way they were, and I think they would have been really good in there. I don't know.
But
I've heard before that they had thought about that, and I think George Martin rejected it. So
they worked pretty well on the Magical Mystery Tour album.
Yeah.
That's true.
It's true.
That's true.
A couple of points I want to bring up here. First of all, about Only a Northern Song. George Harrison did submit that for Sgt. Pepper, and George Martin turned it down. And he said, you could do better than this. So it's not like that song wasn't offered to begin with. And second of all, the Beatles prided themselves from their albums so that you weren't buying the same song twice. So you can apply this logic to every single Beatles album that had a single simultaneously that wasn't on their albums. You could say, well, Beatles for Sale would have been so much better if I Feel Fine and She's a Woman was on there. You can use that with every single. Rubber Soul would have been better with We Can Work It Out and Day Tripper. But the singles were kept separate, and they thought of them as separate entities. And maybe there is some truth that the Beatles themselves thought about Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane maybe for the album, but they worked fine as singles by themselves.
Yeah.
And, for all these years that Sgt. Pepper has been championed as the greatest album of all time, that's without Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane. So the world has not suffered by not having those two songs on Sgt. Pepper.
All right.
Not at all. Plus the fact that, again, it would have, if they had been included on the album, it would have been a 10-month span between Revolver and Sgt. Pepper. And that was pretty much unheard of in that era.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, groups didn't take, you know, it wasn't like it is now where a major act will go 5 years between albums. You know, it just didn't happen in those days.
Mm-hmm.
Next.
The last.
right.
This is the last one. The last one.
Okay.
The last one was when they originally conceived Let It Be. They originally wanted to do a TV special and a live show. And I was thinking, what if they had gone that way? What if they had gone with the TV special and the live and the live gig? I think that would have been very interesting. That would have been, and it would have, you know, obviously we wouldn't have had Let It Be the movie. We wouldn't have had all the what we saw on the screen, but it would have. I think it would have been, you know, I don't know. It might have been a little more positive if we'd have seen the TV special and the live show that they had originally planned. I don't know if that's necessarily a mistake. That is what they had considered early on, and it would have been interesting if they had gone that route.
Well, we don't know because we didn't do it, so you know you can't really judge whether that was a mistake or not. I know that most of us are quite happy with the fact that they did the Apple rooftop concert, and that's now so historic. So,
right.
You know, how do you say that's a mistake?
Well, I mean, number one, Let It Be. Obviously, Let It Be. I mean, it does kind of reflect on the fact that Let It Be is not available now. You know, had it been a TV special and a live show, you know, it probably would be available now. There probably wouldn't be the issues with within the Beatles themselves. I don't know. Allan, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I think that, you know, if they had done what they had planned to do, there would have been an equally historic roundhouse concert or concert in the what did John want to do it in the middle of the Sahara with the sun coming up. And you know, I mean, whatever they did would have been historic because it would have been a one-off concert that would have been preserved as the finale of the show. You know, I guess it's one of those parallel universe questions. What they did is historical, and you know what they would have done is historical if they had, you know, unless they had just let it drop. So it's good that they didn't do that because there was so much, you know, contention that they could well have just said, you know, hell with this, you know.
But I mean, they pretty much ended up doing was pretty much because they were all pretty, you know, they were at the end of their ropes and they said, let's just get it done, you know, let's just do it. And that's what they did. But it's just too bad that they couldn't have come up with a solution on a more, you know, a positive footing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I have Let It Be on my list of things that are mistakes, but I couldn't quite focus on what exactly it was about Let It Be that was a mistake. It just, you know, it started off with the best of intentions and, you know, just ended up being something else. You know, and one of the reasons the film hasn't come out, I gather, is that Paul is kind of unhappy watching it, you know, because it shows the friction between them. And even though everybody knows that the friction between them was there, pretty much the same way everybody knows that this is the 50th anniversary, you know, 51st now. There, you know, he wants history to be the way he wants it to be, and he's just not happy with what that film shows. I believe, however, you know, all of us have probably listened to all of the Let It Be outtakes, audio at least. And assuming there is film for a lot of that stuff, I really believe that you could cut an alternate Let It Be that would actually be a much happier film. And they may do that. I was talking to one of the Apple, Jonathan Clyde, I believe, who, you know, couldn't tell me anything because they're not allowed to talk to the press and, you know, whatever. But so I just mentioned to him, I said, you know, if you put out Let It Be, what you should do is put out the original film, but also cut together a new version of the film that shows the other side of those sessions, because there was a lot of funny stuff and a lot of, you know, that really could be a very Let It Be film. And the sort of look on his face led me to believe that actually they had already done that, you know. So I wish they would actually put that out, but I guess that we're not talking about post-Beatles not putting out stuff as mistakes. But yeah, maybe, you know, giving up to the extent that they weren't involved in what the final cut was, and apparently nobody was happy with it. John felt that it was all a very, not enough John and Yoko. Well, I don't know why he said it, but because there is plenty of them, even waltzing to "I Me Mine," and Paul doesn't like it for the reasons he doesn't like it. I'm sure George didn't like it. Nobody liked it, but no one seemed to have actually wanted to get involved enough to guide it to be sort of a better representation of those sessions. Maybe that's what the mistake was. The real big mistake, of course, is that all four of them really should have been on Life with the Lions. Don't you agree?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Had to stick that in there. We're going to continue now with the few mistakes that I wrote down. And this wasn't very easy for me because in many ways I do kind of view the Beatles as close to perfect as you can get. But one thing that I have lightly touched upon in a previous show here is that towards the end of the Beatles, when George Harrison was really flourishing as a songwriter, John and Paul didn't allow more of his songs to be on their music, notably Let It Be. I mean, you take a look at Abbey Road, and two shining moments, although the whole album is brilliant, are Something and Here Comes the Sun. But by the time that they were doing the Let It Be sessions, the Get Back Let It Be sessions, they were rehearsing a ton of stuff that ended up on All Things Must Pass. Now, I would not want to change history where All Things Must Pass is concerned, because that is such a masterpiece. And in many ways, I wouldn't change a thing about All Things Must Pass. I love all the songs. I love the way it was produced. I'm not one of these anti-Phil Spector people. I loved it exactly the way that it came out. But when the band is rehearsing a song like All Things Must Pass, or Wah Wah, or Beware of Darkness, or Hear Me, Lord, or Isn't It a Pity, all these songs that are such high quality, Let It Down, how can those songs be ignored? And when you think about the Let It Be album, as much as I love I Me Mine and For You Blue, the material to me on All Things Must Pass was stronger. And the only reason why I Me Mine was even done was because they wanted to have something to represent that song, since, as you were just saying, Allan, John and Yoko were waltzing to it while the band was playing it. But, John and Paul did not give George more time when he deserved it towards the end. I'm not going to talk about the early years because George wasn't that productive. He wasn't prolific as a songwriter then. And John and Paul were just banging out so many great songs. But towards the end, when he was really, becoming such a great songwriter, we're talking, 68, 69, how can you not acknowledge that? So to me, the world's perception of the four of them comes from what they did as a band first. And since George always got less time than John and Paul, that carries over to the public's perception of each of the four of them. And, imagine, I mean, you can't change history, how different the whole world would look at the Beatles if from the very beginning the amount of songs between John, Paul, and George on their albums were more equal. But towards the end, when they were together, I think George deserved a few more songs per album. So I don't know how you guys feel about that, but I definitely feel that way.
No question.
I agree. Yeah.
I agree. Too.
There was discussion early on between John and Paul about whether George should be included in the songwriting collaboration. All those songs could have been Lennon, McCartney, Harrison, and they decided against it. So.
Okay. That was one of my mistakes there. Another one has to do with someone named Allan Klein. And just the fact that he was brought in and wanted him to be their business manager, and then got George and Ringo to side with him, even though he knew that Paul wanted Lee Eastman as a manager. And by no means in any way will I ever say that the Beatle breakup itself was a mistake. But by allowing Allan Klein to enter the picture, it really caused a wedge between John and Paul in particular. And so even though, from what I have heard all these years, Mick Jagger to go with Allan Klein, he didn't take his advice. So John must have known at that time that would have caused a huge problem.
I thought
And
Jagger had advised him to go with Klein. I thought it was Jagger recommended Klein to them, I thought.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I thought it was the other way around.
No, it was, I think, that he definitely had recommended Klein to John.
I think later Jagger was down on Klein.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Not at the beginning, no.
Okay. But I think that was, certainly one of the biggest reasons why they did break up. And to me, the breakup was inevitable. It would have happened anyway. The question is, would it have happened that quickly, or could they have continued for a year or two more? But I think that they would have eventually broken up. But I think bringing Allan Klein into the fold was one of the biggest reasons why they did.
But, from the perspective of the other three, if you're in a partnership with three other people and one of them wants to make his father-in-law and brother-in-law your manager, no matter how close friends you are, and the friendships were fraying by this point, I can see how the other three felt that wouldn't have been the right move. And feeling that, having had all this propaganda from the Stones about how much money he got the Stones from Decca, and he was proven at doing this, whereas Lee Eastman, although he was a showbiz lawyer, it wasn't the kind of showbiz the Beatles did. So I think I can see their point of view, and meaning John, George, and Ringo. So I'm not sure it was Allan Klein so much as Paul insisting on his in-laws. Now, with the wisdom of hindsight, Lee Eastman's advice has made Paul an extremely rich man, and he could have done that for all four of them. But
absolutely.
But from at the time, you can see why they were looking a little suspiciously, like, it's your father-in-law, man. Like, what happens if something goes wrong with that relationship? We're all going to be hostage to anything, that could happen maritally. And, I don't know. It was just an odd thing all around.
Yeah. I think people tend to forget the fact that they were all still in their 20s at that point. Mm-hmm. And, Allan, you were in bands in your 20s, right? Mm-hmm. If I recall. And it's kind of, it seems that for various and sundry reasons, whether it's money, whether it's women, whether it's musical differences, whether it's philosophical differences, guys that are in bands in their 20s, and maybe even particularly more so in that era, tended to be, pardon the expression, dicks to each other. and even as multi-talented a group as the Beatles, as mega successful as they were still guys in their 20s, and not terribly worldly and sophisticated guys in their 20s. And I think that's also part of the reason for the way that George's musical output was kind of relegated, because there was, it was, pure ego on the part of, certainly in the part of Paul. And with John, I think it may have been ego fueled by chemicals and maybe other things. Who knows? But that's part of, part and parcel of what drove them apart, was the fact that they just were, from the, the White Album onward, they just were terrible to each other. The interpersonal relationships were absolutely abominable. And that, that's, for me, that's one of the major mistakes, but then that's a part of a series of them. So.
All right. Steve, you want to chime in on this?
Well, I've already said everything that I'm going to say. So as far as but yeah, I mean, we know that they just didn't get along. There was a lot of bad feeling at the end. Even Ringo got in.
Mm-hmm.
Happy-go-lucky Ringo got into it a little bit. So I mean, if that's the case, that's not that shows how bad things were going down at the end. But so there's really not much to say about that.
My last on the list here of mistakes is actually, I guess you might consider this a petty one, because for all the hit records that the Beatles had, they could have had twice as many. And 1964 was the year here in America where they exploded, and there were so many hits right and left. And the thing is, as the years went on, the singles thinned out to the point where 1968 you had Lady Madonna and Hey Jude, and that was it. Think about all the singles they could have released from albums like Sgt. Pepper or the White Album. The White Album never had a single when it came out. Mm-hmm. There's so many songs that could have been hits instantly. I mean, they had so many to begin with, and maybe I'm being greedy here, but there's so many songs that are album cuts. Every time I hear "You're Gonna Lose That Girl," I think to myself, why wasn't that ever a single in 1965? You can apply that to so many songs that they had on their albums, and despite the fact that they are the number one group of all time in terms of hits, they could have easily have had so many more. So, and I'm also thinking in terms of the American market. I'm not thinking about the UK releases because that was all, that was controlled by the Beatles themselves. So, I don't know how you guys feel about it, but...
Well, I think we had all those songs because we had the albums, so it would have been, they prided themselves on this attempt to not sell you the same song twice. I mean, if they had only, been visionary enough to see the CD and download age where they're selling us the same thing every 2 weeks, it would be something different. But,
sure.
I mean, I think they, I don't know. I could see if you were saying, that they should have made more singles because they were so prolific. But to take more singles off albums that we already had, I don't know if I see the necessity of that, really.
Well, certainly in America, they released songs that were singles here that were not in the UK. So
Right.
I'm thinking in terms of also Capitol. I mean, if you had Nowhere Man as a single here, which was never a single in the UK,
Right.
or 8 Days a Week or one of those songs, you could have had plenty more.
Yeah.
They really only became uniform from like 67 on.
Right.
So,
But they didn't like it. The Beatles didn't like that Capitol was doing that. And
Right.
and also in the case of some of those songs, like 8 Days a Week, for instance, I think we got them as singles because Capitol had withheld them from the albums that had been outwritten.
Exactly.
So,
And the other thing too is that AM stations were playing everything. They weren't holding, at least on the when I lived on the East Coast, and you guys would know. I mean, WBZ, WABC, they were playing everything. They weren't just playing singles.
Plus,
I don't know what the point of actually putting out singles.
yeah.
Yes.
And plus, in that era, the concept of releasing singles from albums really had not begun. I mean, the concept of releasing 2, 3, 4 singles from an album really didn't begin. It began with Clive Davis at Columbia, with the second Blood, Sweat and Tears album, and with Simon and Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Water. And certainly in the case of the Beatles, they didn't need to release a second or third single from an album because they were so massively successful that there was just no need for it. Plus, as I said, in those days, at that point in time, it just was not done because the overall attitude toward albums had previously been, that there would just be a single or two already loaded onto the album, and you
got the single first and then the album rather than the.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then by 1968, the year you mentioned, particularly FM radio had become kind of a big force. And that, I think, changed not everybody's attitude, but the attitude of the people who were the Beatles audience, I think, at the time, which was that FM was considered kind of hip and AM was considered something that you no longer listened to. You left it to your little brother and sister to listen to. And so you would have, the White Album would come out and radio stations would play a whole side of the album uninterrupted,
Right.
And I think that the feeling about singles changed a bit. Singles were considered kind of less important. We think of them now as chart things. We look back at the Beatles' history and say, as I guess you're saying, they had 20 number ones. They could have had 40. Mm-hmm. But at the time, it was okay. We don't really care about singles anymore unless they're not on the album, or unless they're out so far before the album is that you kind of need to get it. I mean, at the time, I got the Let It Be single partly because, My Name, Look Up Number was on the back and wasn't on anything, but I never bothered with the Long and Winding Road single because I already had the album. Why would I need that and For You Blue on a single, So it's interesting.
But yet at the same time, those singles went to number one. Mm-hmm. So Top 40 radio was still doing extremely well by then, the late 60s and throughout the 70s too. So I'm being greedy here. That's all. I just think that the Beatles could have had many more. You take a look at 1964 and all the singles that were released in America that weren't UK singles. You can take a look at And I Love Her, Back With If I Fell, I'll Cry Instead. Those singles. There were a lot of singles that came out here. The Beatles probably were oblivious to it all. And, there could have been more of that. That's all.
But I think they saw that because of the fact that, for instance, in the case of the songs from A Hard Day's Night, Capitol did release 2, 3, 4 singles. It was they, in a sense, kind of clogged up the charts and kind of negated each other in effect. So I think that may be part of it, but I think overall it's just the fact that in those days, it just wasn't done to release second and third singles from an album.
All right, it's just that whenever I hear something like, especially when it concerned the movie Help, those songs that were in the movie, any one of them could have been hits.
Oh, sure.
So
well, it's kind of like what Steve was saying that Top 40 radio was playing every single track from every single Beatles album. And, so it was almost as if they were all singles.
Okay.
In terms of, how the audience was receiving them.
We're all making a good point here. And I'm still, as someone who's a chart buff, and I love the fact that the Beatles broke all records and certainly continue to have all the success they did in their solo careers. I wanted more success. So how about you, Al? What were the mistakes that you listed?
Well, actually, we've covered some of them because the mistakes that I came up with basically come almost consecutively over a period of 2 years, beginning really in the days after August 27th, 1967. Because, I mean, the mere fact that the Beatles didn't even turn up for Brian Epstein's memorial service was I think, a mistake. The excuse was given that they didn't want to cause, Beatlemania type scenes in the streets. That could have been alleviated. But I think it was a bad thing that they didn't even turn up for the man's memorial service. And then, to go into Magical Mystery Tour with as little preparation as we, discussed earlier. And then to set up Apple as amateurishly as it was set up. And then, including the various divisions, including the Apple shop, which was run, very amateurishly, and indeed had to be closed shortly after it actually opened. And then the deterioration in relations within the group over, musical differences and philosophical differences and business differences and all the rest of it that we just went into. I think all of that, basically the last 2 years of their time as a group, much of it was laden with mistakes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
In fact, actually, Al's point there was the very last thing on my list that hadn't already been discussed. So
what's that?
Thanks, Al. Well, one of them, the amateur setting up of Apple, the fact that they, it was again hubris, like with Magical Mystery Tour. It's like, well, okay, and now we can be a business, and with the best intentions, we're gonna be open to people who want to do creative projects without quite thinking that meant that every single, little kid and huckster in the world was going to be at their doorstep asking for money. The Apple, I think, as a whole, it did some great stuff. The Apple label, you look at the Apple label discography, it is an incredible discography
for
a short time. But, the things like, I guess we won't get into their electronics division.
No, please.
But, and some of their other stuff, you mentioned the shop,
right.
that was so. But yeah, your point was basically the only thing I had left on my list that we hadn't somehow discussed. So,
yeah. And again, I think we forget that, again, these were guys who were these are guys who were still in their 20s and were not very worldly and not very sophisticated and really had no knowledge of business. And just, either never got the right advice or maybe no advice at all.
Mm-hmm. Well, they weren't willing to take advice.
Well, that too. Exactly. Yeah. Very true.
Yeah. And as Ringo said, they were musicians, not businessmen.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that showed. And it is kind of fascinating that, like you said, Allan, the music on the Apple label was really impressive.
Mm-hmm.
It's so varied, and it really was, as I said before, it's more an extension of themselves. The fact that they just embraced all different types of genres of music, and even had spoken word in there. They mixed everything on Apple Records. And, of course, whether or not the records turned out to be successful is another story to itself. Mm-hmm. But, to suddenly start a business when you're not really businessmen, and they brought a lot of friends along, probably because these were people they could trust, even though they may not know much about business, that also contributed too. But, these are all great points that we've all raised here.
And then even though it's after the fact, also Apple Records could have been even more a longer lasting label and perhaps even greater quality, but they lost interest in it in the early 70s.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Which is a
shame. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's why that last single has, This Guitar Can't Keep From Crying, has that Shoot Up Apple as its as its label.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really a fascinating part of their history to go into Apple Records, because they were all involved in their own way with other artists, and certainly in the case of George, I think a lot of people would be surprised at how involved George Harrison was with many of the different artists on Apple Records. But, you take a look at, as a musician or as a producer, how many people he tried to help. Mm-hmm. And they all did in various degrees. But, it's a fascinating part of their story, which we should get into in a future show.
Yes, definitely.
Yes.
So that puts the show to a close. Thanks so much for tuning in. On behalf of Steve Marinucci, Allan Kozin, and Al Sussman, I'm Ken Michaels, thanking all of you for listening to Things We Said Today, and we'll see you next time.